This video is a continuation of the discussion we've been having about modifying input parameters in vRO. We began the discussion back in part 50. If you haven't seen that part, take a look up here and go back to part 50. To demonstrate this first technique, let's start by creating a new workflow. I'll call this new workflow first technique. Now, in actual practice, I should go over to the General tab and I should type a description and do the usual things I should do, but in the interest of speeding up this video, I'm going to jump ahead a bit here. In fact, I'm going to jump straight to let's go to the Inputs tab, and as you'll recall, we need two variables here. One of those variables I'm going to call in myvar. That is going to be a number, so let me change its type. And again, I should type a description, but to save time, I'm going to skip that. So I've got an input parameter called inMyVar, and it's a number type variable. I also need a attribute. Let me shrink this section here. There we go. And I will add a new attribute called myvar, which is also going to be a number. And I could type a value. In this case, I'm not going to need to, so I'll leave that blank. And I should type a description, but to save time, I'm not going to. So I have an attribute called myvar and an input parameter called inMyvar. Now, to use this first technique, what we're going to do is go to the schema, and we'll drag in a scriptable task. We'll go down to the pane in the bottom, and over here we'll go to the in tab, because we need to bring in the value of the input parameter into this scriptable task. So to do so, we've gone to the in tab. We'll click the bind to workflow parameter or attribute button. And when we do so, as you can see, with an inward binding, we can either bind to an input parameter, which is what this first variable is, or we could do an inward binding to an attribute, which the second variable is. An inward binding is possible to either of these variables. For our purposes, though, we're going to do a binding to myvar, the attribute. And we'll click select. Now, notice what we've got here. We have a binding. On the in tab, we have an inward binding between two different variables. Now, these columns are not labeled this exactly, but I think of this first column as the local variable column. There is a local variable now in the scriptable task, a local variable called myvar. For the second column, though it doesn't say this exactly, I think of this as saying workflow variable. This here is a workflow variable. It currently happens to be an attribute, although it could have been an input parameter. But my local variable, called myvar, is connected to a workflow variable that happens to have the exact same name, and which is an attribute. So far so good, except the problem here is the local variable myvar does not contain the value of the input parameter. So what we can do here is create an inward binding. With a little trickery here, we can create an inward binding between our local variable and our workflow variable that holds the value of the input parameter, which, as you'll recall, our input parameter is the one called inMyvar. So instead of linking our local variable to the workflow attribute, we're going to click here and change this. So the source parameter, the workflow variable, is currently the attribute, but we're going to click here and change that to bind to the input parameter instead. So we'll select the input parameter and click select. Now at this point, within this scriptable task, the local variable called myvar actually currently contains the value of whatever the user passed into inMyvar, the input parameter. So in effect, we've already achieved the necessary task of copying the input parameter's value into a variable. But right now that variable is local to our scriptable task, and only in the scriptable task will we see that variable. Okay, so we're partway there with this technique, but there's one other thing that we need to do. We're going to need to set up an outward binding. Let's go to the Out tab. And again, we'll click the binding button here. And in this case, we're going to only have the choice of myvar. Since we're doing an outward binding, the input parameter doesn't show up in this list now. For an outward binding, we can only bind to an output parameter. We don't have any of those. Or to an attribute, which is what myvar is. So I'm going to bind to the one and only thing I've got, which is this variable called myvar. So at this point, our workflow schema element, the scriptable task, has a variable called myvar that contains the value of the original input parameter, but because we also have an outward binding, we're able to actually make a change to that variable called myvar, and then have that variable's value show up in other parts of our workflow. But there's one more thing you have to do. Now, some people, when they use this technique, say that no coding is required, but in actual practice, you do need to type some code. You'll notice if I click validate, I get a warning message here, and if it's not an outright error, it's just a warning, but if I want to make that warning message go away, I've got to add some code. So I'll go to the scripting tab. I'm going to type some code, but as you can see, I just type // all this is a comment. So I'll say no code required, which strictly speaking isn't true. I mean, even though that's a comment, that's actual code. So strictly speaking, you do have to have some code here to make that warning message go away. So now that we've got this, in any other scriptable tasks or other schema elements in our workflow from here on out, if we do an inward binding to the attribute called myvar, we'll be able to see what's in that variable, and we'll also be able to do an outward binding to the attribute called myvar, thereby enabling us to change the value of the attribute anywhere we want from here on out in our workflow. But what we've done in effect with this first scriptable task is we did the copying. So why don't we actually change the name of the scriptable task to something a little more descriptive, like copy input parameter, or maybe it's parameters, to attributes. So that's what the scriptable task does, and from here on out in our workflow, we will be able to make use of that attribute. We can see the original value of the input parameter. We can change the value, not of the input parameter, but of our attribute. So again, this was the first of two techniques I'm going to show you. For me personally, this is not my preferred technique because it tends to rely on trickery is perhaps too strong of a word for it, but the way we set it up in this particular case is depending upon some side effects that aren't immediately obvious. There's a side effect going on here that gets the variable copied over, and that's not immediately, if you're paying real close attention to the bindings in a workflow, if I'm reading someone else's workflow and I look really closely at these two columns, I can deduce that some copying is going on, but it's not obvious. So again, this is the first technique. It works, but it's not my preferred technique. Join me in the next video where I'll show you another technique for modifying input parameters in vRO.